I'm Paula Felix-Didier, and currently I'm the director of Museo del Cine Pablo de Grosshicken, which is the Buenos Aires Film Museum in Argentina. The Museo del Cine holds a collection of, films. There are 65,000 cans of films, mostly newsreels and Argentinian fiction film, but also shorts and international films like Metropolis. Then we have stills and books, magazines, documents, costumes, cameras, an amazing collection of cameras, including Lumiere camera number 4, serial number 4, which is cool. We've all seen in Buenos Aires and everywhere else the Giorgio Moroder version of Metropolis that was released in theaters, and we knew about the story that the original negative was lost, and that the Paramount version was the one who has been around for years and years. So Fernando Peña, who's a curator, film programmer, collector, and a historian too, Fernando knew about this. There were several versions of Metropolis, and at that time he was working for this film society, and the guy who ran the film society told him about the Manuel Peña Rodriguez collection. Peña Rodriguez was a private collector who owned the print of Metropolis. And Fernando started doing some research, so he learned that Metropolis was released in Buenos Aires in March 1928, and it was brought to Argentina by this distributor called Alfredo Wilson, who had a distribution company called Terra. And Wilson usually traveled to Europe and watched films and bought what he liked. So Fernando found this magazine, an interview in a magazine where he talked about how he was in Berlin when the first release of Metropolis happened. Metropolis was released twice in Germany too. So the first version, Fritz Lang's version, was only in theaters for 4 months. And then they because it didn't do so well, they decided to re-release it after cutting it a little bit. So that very first version was actually seen by a few people at the time. But Wilson was one of those people, and he liked it and he bought it at that time. So Fernando Peña suspected that the print that was released, that the version that was released in Buenos Aires might be the longer version. Somehow one print of Metropolis ended up in the hands of a private collector, Manuel Peña Rodriguez, who was a film critic at the time for La Nación, which is one of the biggest newspapers in Argentina. He then became a film producer, and he was one of those collectors who didn't have a problem with lending his prints. So we know that Metropolis was screened at this film society's screenings at least until 1959. When Manuel Peña Rodriguez died, his collection was donated to the National Endowment for the Arts in Argentina, which is not a collecting institution, and it's not a film archive. So they got all this a huge collection of silent films. It was 35 millimeter nitrate prints of at least 100 silent films. Somebody told them that it was very dangerous to keep nitrate if you didn't have the proper facility. So they decided to get rid of the nitrate, and before doing that, they transferred it onto 16 millimeter acetate safety film. They didn't have enough money to do it on 35, that's why they did it on 16. But also, it was not a very well done job. The lab who did the transfer was not a very good lab. And they didn't clean the film. They cut the intertitles so that they could save some stock. And also they used a sound gate. So Metropolis being a silent film, they had the 35 millimeter silent gate, which is bigger, so the image got cropped. So they ended up with all these 16 millimeter negatives all scratched and with stains and dirt and all these problems. And the collection was donated in 1992 to the Museo del Cine. Fernando Peña tried to get his hands on this print for maybe 18 years, and there were always problems. The museum moved several times, and so he couldn't get his hands on the print for 18 years. And when I was appointed director of the museum in January 2008, I knew Fernando pretty well, because we used to be a couple in early 90s. We ran that film magazine together, and I knew about the story. And he told me, okay, we should do this. We should go and check, not only the Metropolis print, but the whole collection. And the first thing we did was to open the Metropolis can and check the version. Even if it was 16 and even if it was a negative, we could easily tell that at least some of the missing things were there. So Fernando did a transfer. We transferred it onto DV-Cam and DVD so that we can see it. And when we saw it, we realized that most of the missing things were there. A lot of people are frustrated when they hear that in Argentina they destroyed and they actually set the nitrate on fire. But that is kind of common practice when you realize how dangerous it is to keep nitrate if you can't secure the proper conditions. It's not done anymore now that the audiovisual preservation field became more professional, but it was done. And it's not something to be proud of, but at least we have this 16 millimeter version. It is something. Maybe 10% of all silent films are left, and they say that 50% of all sound films are lost too. So this print surviving was really against all odds. The original camera negative was lost in the war. Many of the prints were lost in the war. And the fact that this print survived, I think, speaks to the value of private collectors first, and second, of public archives. And the new, audiovisual preservation is kind of a new field, and I think that it, ever since the 70s, there's more awareness about how difficult it is to take care of films, but also how easy they get lost or destroyed. It was one of the most looked for films in the archiving world. Everybody was looking. I mean, it's Metropolis, Greed, Magnificent Ambersons, and London After Midnight. So because of these whole different versions and Eno Patala's work and the different restorations, it was really exciting as an archivist to be able to be part of that story. When it happened and we announced it in a press conference, here in Buenos Aires and in Bologna, I think it was in the Cinema Ritrovato Festival that the Moral Stiftung announced it. We started getting phone calls from all over the world, newspapers, radios, TV channels. I had to stop journalists from coming into the museum the next week after this happened. And I was not prepared for that. I thought it was going to be a big news, but not this big. The media hype around this finding, I think, was very useful for several things. One thing was to draw attention to the museum and to the field of film preservation in Argentina, but also it was useful to grow awareness in the whole world about audiovisual preservation. It's not a sexy topic. It's not every day that it's on the newspapers or on TV or in the radio. So that was a good thing about this.